Okay, let's get into it. For decades, the whole world was basically defined by this one massive standoff, the Cold War.
An incredibly tense period.
Right, and we often talk about the Western side, NATO. But today, we're flipping that around. We are focusing entirely on the other side,
The Eastern Bloc's military club.
the Warsaw Pact.
And you really can't understand the 20th century without understanding the pact. It wasn't just some casual agreement. It was a formal, very calculated military alliance set up in May 1955.
And what was the trigger?
It was a direct response to a perceived threat, specifically West Germany being allowed to rearm and join NATO.
A classic Cold War move. One side makes a move, the other side counters.
Exactly. So the treaty gets signed in Warsaw, hence the name, the Warsaw Pact, and boom. Instantly, Europe is solidified into these two huge opposing military camps.
You've got the Communist East, led by the Soviet Union, facing off against the Democratic West.
And while on paper it was about mutual defense, there was no question who was in charge. The Soviet Union was the leader, and it used the pact to ensure total political loyalty from all its members.
How big was this alliance, really?
Oh, the scale was enormous. There were 8 founding members, of course, the Soviet Union, then Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania.
Albania didn't stick around, though, did they?
That's right. Albania actually withdrew later in 1968. But for most of its existence, this group of countries operated like one single massive military machine.
And if you look at a map, their location is no accident. It's incredibly strategic.
Absolutely. Together, they created what military planners call a buffer zone.
A buffer zone, so like a protective layer, a human shield almost.
That's a good way to think of it. It was a huge stretch of territory between Western Europe and the Soviet heartland. The idea was simple. Any land invasion from the West would have to fight its way across multiple countries first.
Buying the Soviets critical time and resources.
Exactly. And this wasn't just a line on a map. This was the infamous Iron Curtain, a real physical barrier in many places, with fences, walls, guard towers.
And all the command and control, all the big decisions, they all came from one place.
All from Moscow. It was the undisputed central command post.
So if Moscow was the brain, what about the military structure itself? How tight was that Soviet control?
It was absolute.
Yeah.
This wasn't like NATO where command might rotate. In the Warsaw Pact, a Soviet officer always held the top job.
The supreme commander.
Always a Soviet. And this was deliberate. It made sure that the national armies, the Polish army, the Hungarian army, couldn't develop their own independent strategies or ideas that might go against Soviet goals.
They were essentially just extensions of the Soviet Red Army.
They were. And what was fascinating, and maybe a little damaging in the long run, was the level of standardization. Everyone used the same tactics, and more importantly, the same equipment. This meant they could hold these gigantic military exercises.
Right.
We're talking hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks, all moving at once.
Simulating a huge push into Western Europe.
A lightning-fast push. It was all about speed and overwhelming numbers.
And when we talk about that equipment, what comes to mind?
Well, the AK-47 assault rifle. That was the standard weapon for every single soldier in the alliance. Rugged, easy to make.
And for the heavy stuff.
You had the T-54 and T-55 tanks. They made just astronomical numbers of them. And in the air, you had the MiG series of jet fighters protecting the skies.
So this reliance on Soviet gear wasn't just about saving money.
Oh, not at all. It was a strategic trap set by Moscow. Sure, having uniform parts and ammo made logistics easier, but it also created this powerful political leash.
A leash. Because if you wanted to act independently, you couldn't.
How could you? Your entire military, your supply lines, your spare parts, it all depended on the Soviets. And that technology was often years behind NATO's. Moscow chose quantity over cutting-edge quality.
That sets the stage perfectly for what was probably the most tense place on the entire planet back then.
East Germany.
Right. It had this unique, incredibly vital role because it was the front line. It directly bordered West Germany, a huge NATO member.
And that fact shaped everything about life there.
Yeah.
The entire territory was turned into one giant fortification. We're talking walls, fences, minefields, watchtowers stretching for hundreds of miles.
And the most famous symbol of it all.
The Berlin Wall. A concrete barrier running through the middle of a city. It was the most chilling physical symbol of the entire Cold War.
Planners on both sides just assumed that if a war started, it would start right there.
It wasn't a maybe, it was a when. So you had massive numbers of troops, the most advanced surveillance gear, everything poised and ready right on that border. East Germany was where World War III was expected to begin.
But focusing on that potential external war kind of misses what the pact was actually used for most of the time, doesn't it?
It really does. It's so important to understand that the Warsaw Pact wasn't just about defending against NATO. Its most powerful function was actually internal.
A tool for the Soviet Union to keep order in its own backyard.
Precisely. The treaty was written in a way that, well, it justified keeping Soviet troops stationed in all these countries permanently. It basically gave them the right to intervene if a member government started to get ideas about, say, leaving the pact.
So it was an ideological police force disguised as a military alliance.
That's a perfect description. And we saw it in action in the most brutal way, twice.
The first case being Hungary in 1956.
The Hungarian uprising. The government there, responding to huge public demand, tried to leave the pact and declare neutrality. Moscow saw this as an existential threat.
They couldn't let one piece fall out of place.
Absolutely not. So Soviet tanks rolled right into Budapest. They crushed the revolution, thousands were killed, and a new, loyal government was installed. The message was crystal clear. You cannot leave.
And then, just over a decade later, it almost happened again. In Czechoslovakia.
1968, the Prague Spring. This was a little different. They weren't trying to leave the alliance, but they were trying to create socialism with a human face.
Which meant more freedom, more rights for citizens.
Yes, political liberalization. And the Soviet leadership was terrified. They feared this idea could spread, that it would weaken their iron grip on the whole region.
And what was so unique about the response to the Prague Spring was that it wasn't just the Soviets who invaded.
That's right. This time, hundreds of thousands of Warsaw Pact troops from 5 different member nations all invaded Czechoslovakia together to stop the reforms. It showed just how deep the commitment to internal policing was.
And they even gave it a name, a doctrine to justify it.
They did. It became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. It basically stated that the Soviet Union had the right to intervene in any socialist country if they decided socialism itself was under threat.
So if we step back, you have these two giant opposing alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact.
Mirror images of each other, but fundamentally different. NATO was mostly democratic nations, and participation was more or less voluntary. The Warsaw Pact was communist states, all led by one superpower that demanded total obedience.
But they shared that constant, terrifying tension.
Oh, yes. Both sides spent billions on weapons, kept millions of soldiers on high alert. They never fought a direct war, what some call the long peace, but they were locked in this ruinously expensive arms race.
Especially with nuclear missiles.
Exactly. Nuclear missiles that could destroy cities in minutes. That reality of these two massive armies staring each other down across the Iron Curtain, it defined life for everyone on the planet.
And for a kid growing up, say, in East Germany in the 70s, what was daily life like under that system?
It was completely structured by the state. In school, you were taught intense loyalty to the government and the alliance. There was constant propaganda about the dangers of the West.
And what about simple things like travel?
Travel to the West, almost impossible for a regular family. And information was completely controlled. TV, newspapers, radio, it was all state-run, giving you a very narrow view of the world.
So the military presence was just normal.
It was. Military parades, soldiers on the street, mandatory youth groups. That was just part of growing up. But maybe the biggest daily stress was economic. There were constant shortages of basic consumer goods.
Because all the money was going to the military.
So much of it was. To the tanks and the jets. So you'd have long lines for simple things, from clothes to even certain types of food. It created a constant sense of hardship.
So the very thing designed to protect the pact, its military, was also hollowing it out from the inside.
That's the irony. And by the 1980s, you could really see the cracks forming. The economies were failing, the technology gap with the West was getting wider and wider.
And the Soviet Union itself was running out of money.
They just couldn't afford it anymore. They couldn't afford to prop up all these other economies and maintain their massive military at the same time.
And then came the huge political change in Moscow.
Mikhail Gorbachev. He introduced reforms, glasnost and perestroika, and most importantly, he signaled that the Soviet Union would no longer intervene in other countries' affairs.
The end of the Brezhnev Doctrine.
And that was the kill switch. Once the threat of Soviet tanks was gone, the whole system just collapsed. People across Eastern Europe started protesting for freedom, and this time, no one stopped them.
And then the most powerful symbol of all came crashing down in 1989.
The Berlin Wall.
Oh.
Not torn down by an army, but by ordinary citizens. It was the end. The political order just vanished.
So when did it officially end?
The Warsaw Pact was formally dissolved in July of 1991. Just a few months before the Soviet Union itself fell apart, the Cold War was over.
What a legacy. Its collapse removed that 40-year threat of a massive land war in Europe, and the great irony, of course.
Is that most of its former members, like Poland and Hungary, eventually rushed to join their old rival, NATO.
Yeah.
The Warsaw Pact is really a defining story of the Cold War. It shows how an alliance built for defense can be twisted into a tool for control, one that just couldn't survive the pressure of history.
And the question to think about now is how often alliances, created for one reason, end up being used to control their own members, especially when things get tough.
Good luck with your studies.